On a stormy morning in Red Willow, a young mechanic named Ethan was racing to the most important job interview of his life when he spotted an older woman, soaked, trembling, struggling with a blown tire on the side of Highway 22. He knew stopping meant risking everything, but he still pulled over to help. What Ethan didn't know was that this small act of kindness would unravel a family's past and rewrite his own future in ways he never imagined. Before we dive in, where are you from? Drop a comment below and tell me, and don't forget to hype and subscribe for more heartwarming stories every day. On a gray Monday morning in Red Willow, Ohio, the sky looked like wet cement waiting to fall apart, and Ethan Miller was hunched over the steering wheel of his aging pickup, whispering a prayer he didn't really believe in. The heater coughed out air that smelled faintly of burnt oil, the windshield wipers fought uselessly against the sheets of rain, and the whole truck shivered like it was trying to talk him out of driving at all. But he kept going, because today was supposed to be different. Today was the interview at Hartman Motors, the one job that might actually pull him and his daughter out of the financial quicksand they'd been sinking in for years. He had rehearsed answers in the bathroom mirror the night before, while Lily pretended not to listen, and he knew he only had one shot, one chance, one morning where everything needed to go right. But life in Red Willow never cared what you needed. As the highway stretched ahead, Ethan kept checking the rearview mirror, not for traffic, but to make sure his thrift store tie still looked halfway presentable. It didn't. Nothing stayed in place in that truck. Not his hopes, not the glove compartment, not the radio that crackled out old country songs like it was dying in real time. He pressed the accelerator a little harder. 11 minutes until his interview. 11 minutes between still struggling and maybe things get better. 11 minutes he couldn't afford to waste. Then halfway through a blind curve on Route 22 he saw her. A sedan sat crooked on the shoulder, hazard lights blinking weakly through the storm. A woman, older, maybe early 60s, stood beside it, rain running off her coat in relentless streams. Even from a distance, Ethan could see the blown tire, shredded rubber, bent rim, the kind of blowout that left you stranded no matter how steady you tried to stand. But what caught him wasn't the tire, it was her face. She wasn't just wet or irritated like most people would be in a storm like this. She looked lost, truly lost. Her hands hovered helplessly near the wheel well, trembling with a frustration she was trying and failing to hide. Her gaze kept darting to her watch, then to the empty road, like she was counting seconds she absolutely could not spare. There was urgency in every tiny movement, shoulders tight, lips pressed thin, breath uneven. Whatever she was late for, it wasn't small, it wasn't optional. And the longer she stood there, the more her composure cracked, letting raw panic peek through. Ethan's foot hovered between the gas and the brake. This was the moment, the first tiny shift in a day he'd been praying would finally break his way. He could keep driving, make that interview, maybe get the job, maybe give Lily a childhood where she didn't have to overhear late-night conversations about rent and overdue bills. Or he could stop, lose time he didn't have, help someone who wasn't his responsibility. And as that internal tug-of-war pulled tighter in his chest, something familiar rose up in him, quiet but impossible to ignore. His father's voice. "Son, you help folks when they need it. Doesn't matter who they are." The rain slammed against the windshield as if urging him to choose fast. And for a split second, Ethan could almost feel Lily's small hand slipping into his, asking if he'd get the new job, if things would be okay now. He wanted to tell her yes, he wanted so badly for that to be true. But his father's voice won, the way it always did. He braked hard. The truck rattled as it came to a stop, protesting like it knew what this would cost him. Ethan sat there with both hands gripping the wheel, breathing through the panic of knowing he was probably throwing away his best chance. Then he grabbed his old metal toolbox, still carrying the faint scent of his dad's aftershave, and stepped into the storm. As he walked toward her, gravel crunching under his boots, he got a clearer look. The woman had a dignified presence about her, not fragile but not exactly built for the side of a highway either. Her silver hair clung to her face, and when she turned, her eyes widened with relief so genuine it cut right through the tension winding inside him. She tried to smile, but it trembled in the corners. "Car trouble?" Ethan asked, crouching beside the ruined tire, water dripping off his jacket in steady lines. Yes, she answered, voice carrying a calm, practiced steadiness that didn't quite hide the fear underneath. I sent my driver home last night. I needed time alone to think before a very difficult meeting today. He nodded, already loosening lug nuts with the wrench his father had put in his hands before he was old enough to swing it properly. Rain soaked into his shirt, the cold cutting straight through, but his hands kept moving. Habit, muscle memory. The kind of skill that didn't require thinking. She watched him with an attention that felt surprising, not polite, not superficial, but deeply present. Thank you for stopping, she said, almost too softly. Most people just drive past. Most people have somewhere to be. Ethan replied, half joking, half telling the truth he didn't want to think about. He didn't look at the time again. He already knew. As he worked, she asked his name. He told her. She hesitated before offering hers. Maggie, just Maggie, no last name, though something about her made him think she was the type of person who usually introduced herself fully, confidently. He finished the spare in 20 minutes, though it felt like trading 20 years of his life for a single good deed. When she tried to pay him, he shook his head. Just help the next person who needs it, he said, hearing his father's voice mix with his own. Something shifted in her expression, like the mask of calm she wore every day cracked just slightly, revealing something older, heavier, more human. When she drove away, Ethan stood in the rain, heart sinking as fast as the taillights vanished. He didn't need a clock to know he'd missed the interview. But he also didn't know, not yet, how deeply that single choice would pull his life in a direction he never saw coming. By the time Ethan pulled back into Red Willow, the storm had softened into a tired drizzle that clung to the windows like the morning didn't know if it should stop fighting or keep going. He felt the same way. The highway stretched behind him in a wet ribbon of missed chances, and the digital clock on his dashboard confirmed what he already knew in his bones. The interview at Hartman Motors was long over, not delayed, not salvageable. Over. There was a hollow ache behind his ribs as the truck rattled down Maple Grove's narrow lane, an ache shaped suspiciously like regret, and the longer he sat with it, the more the morning replayed itself in jagged little flashes. Maggie's wide eyes, the shredded tire, the way she tried to hide her fear behind that steady voice. Every time he tried to imagine driving past her, his stomach twisted. He wouldn't have been able to live with himself, but that didn't make the consequences any lighter. As he turned into their small patch of gravel beside the trailer, he caught the familiar sight of Lily's hand-drawn chalk doodles scattered across the front steps, stars, crooked flowers, a cartoon version of their truck with oversized wheels. Little anchors of a world that depended on him showing up, no matter how tired he was. He killed the engine and sat there, letting the silence fall over him like a heavy blanket, trying to gather the words he'd need to explain why today, the day he had promised would be different, had turned out exactly like all the others. The front door creaked open before he reached it. Lily appeared in the doorway with her backpack still half unzipped, her hair in 2 loose braids she'd probably done herself while he was gone. Her expression hovered in that careful space children learn too early when they grow up with uncertainty, hopeful enough to wish for good news, guarded enough to expect the opposite. "Hey Dad," she said, watching him with that gentle seriousness he both admired and hated, because kids shouldn't have to read their parents like weather reports. How'd it go? The question hit him harder than he expected. He wasn't angry at her, never at her. He was angry at the weight life kept piling on both of them, pushing her into a maturity she hadn't had time to choose. He forced a smile that felt thin around the edges. "Come on," he said, hanging his wet jacket on the chair as she stepped aside to let him in. The trailer smelled faintly of toast and the lavender air freshener she'd insisted on buying with her own allowance. He sat down across from her at the tiny kitchen table, the same table where they solved homework problems, shared cheap takeout, and talked about things no 10-year-old should have to worry about. His tie was still around his neck, soggy and defeated, and as he touched it, the truth pressed against him until he had no choice but to say it. "I missed the interview." Lily stilled, spoon halfway to her mouth, eyes steady and unblinking. She didn't gasp or panic, she waited, letting him finish, which somehow made everything harder. There was a woman stranded on Route 22, older lady, her tire blew out. I stopped to help, and by the time I got back on the road, he didn't need to finish." Lily lowered the spoon, her face softening the way it always did when she was trying to absorb something grown-up. Her voice, when it came, was quiet but clear. "Mom used to say you'd give away your last dollar to help someone who needed it." Ethan closed his eyes for a moment. It had been years since her mother passed, but sometimes it felt like grief was a room they still lived in, one with doors they hadn't figured out how to close. Hearing her name said aloud, especially in that tone, brought back the memory of nights spent promising Lily things would get better someday. She was right, Lily added simply, no judgment, no sting, just truth, truth he wasn't sure he deserved, but truth she offered anyway. He exhaled, shoulders dropping as the tension unwound just a fraction. He expected disappointment, or fear, or at least frustration at another setback. Instead, his daughter's acceptance wrapped around him with a warmth that made his chest tighten. "Are you gonna be okay about the job?" she asked, more careful now, like she was trying not to poke a bruise. He looked at her, really looked, this kid with her mother's quiet strength and his stubborn streak, trying so hard to be brave for both of them. And he knew he couldn't lie to her, not about this. "I'm upset," he admitted, "but we'll figure it out." "We always do." Lily studied him for a second, then nodded with a certainty that felt older than 10 years old. "Yeah," she said, "we do." That confidence, her confidence, was the thing that steadied him more than anything else ever could. She had weathered so much already, the hospital bills, the nights he worked late, the mornings when breakfast was cereal because payday was still 2 days out. And yet she still believed in him, without hesitation. That belief alone felt like a second chance he hadn't earned but desperately needed. As she went back to eating, Ethan leaned back in his chair, watching her tap the spoon lightly against the bowl in a rhythm that echoed throughout their small kitchen, filling the silence with something almost peaceful. In that moment, surrounded by chipped counters and flickering lights and a childhood held together by love instead of money, Ethan realized something he hadn't let himself consider on the drive home. Maybe missing the interview wasn't the end of anything. Maybe it was just the middle of a story he hadn't seen the shape of yet. He didn't know it, and neither did Lily, but somewhere else in Red Willow, a woman named Maggie Haynes was making a phone call that would bend the rest of their lives in a direction neither of them could imagine. For now though, all that mattered was this small kitchen, this small family, and the quiet reassurance of a daughter who still believed the world hadn't given up on them. And maybe, just maybe, she was right. The next morning at Murphy's Auto Repair started like any other Tuesday in Red Willow, the smell of burnt oil drifting through the bays, old country music buzzing from a radio someone had duct-taped to a shelf, and Ethan half buried under the hood of a rusted-out Chevy that had more miles than good decisions behind it. The routine felt almost comforting after yesterday's chaos, even if a quiet ache lingered in his chest, reminding him of the interview he never made. He tried to bury the thought, focusing on the steady rhythm of tools clinking against metal, convincing himself there'd be other opportunities, even if he didn't fully believe it. He definitely wasn't prepared for what came next. The shop door chimed, an ordinary sound, but something about it made Ethan pause. Maybe it was the hush that fell across the garage, or the way Clyde, the oldest mechanic there, looked up with a frown as if expecting trouble. Ethan stepped back from the engine, wiping his hands on a rag, and when he turned toward the entrance, he froze. She was standing there. Maggie, the woman from Route 22, except this version of her looked nothing like the rain-soaked stranger he'd found on the highway. She wore a simple navy dress that somehow made her look both understated and expensive. Her hair, once plastered to her face by the storm, was now neatly brushed and pinned back, and the calm confidence she radiated filled the space in a way that didn't match the vulnerability he'd seen less than 24 hours earlier. In her hands were 2 steaming cups of coffee from Beamline Roasters, a cafe so pricey Ethan had only seen the inside once and left regretting it for an entire week of lunches. "Morning," she said, stepping forward and holding one cup out to him like they'd planned this. Like she wasn't a mystery that had just dropped back into his world without warning. Ethan blinked, caught between confusion and suspicion. "Maggie?" he asked, almost to confirm she was real. She smiled. "I thought you could use this." She glanced around the shop with a warmth that felt out of place in a room filled with grease stains and half-solved mechanical complaints. "Can we talk?" That question, calm, casual and way too deliberate, sent a ripple of unease through him. People didn't just show up out of the blue with expensive coffee and soft smiles unless they wanted something. And Maggie, well, Maggie didn't seem like someone who did things without a reason. But he took the coffee anyway, part politeness, part curiosity, part something more instinctual he didn't have a name for yet. They stepped outside to the weathered wooden bench by the entrance, watching traffic crawl past Red Willow's 2 stoplights. The sky was clearing, patches of pale blue peeking through, as if trying to make up for yesterday. "I feel bad about yesterday," Maggie said first, her tone gentle but steady. "You missed something important because of me." Ethan shook his head automatically. "Nobody forced me to stop, I made a choice." He took a sip of the coffee, smooth, rich, way better than anything he brewed at home, and tried not to let the taste soften him too much. "My dad taught me that helping people is the right thing, even if it costs you." Maggie watched him closely, almost studying him, and it made him shift a little on the bench. Not because the attention was uncomfortable, but because it felt intentional, like she was evaluating something he didn't know he was being tested for. Then came the next moment, the one that made the air shift. "I asked a few people about you after yesterday. Everyone had the same thing to say. You help people even when it costs you," she asked, voice light but loaded with something underneath. Ethan let out a short laugh, more defensive than amused. "Nice fairy tale. But companies like Hartman don't hand out second chances to guys who show up late." He lifted the cup slightly. "This is great coffee, but it doesn't fix reality." Maggie didn't look away. "What if reality can change?" she asked again, quieter this time, and as she said it, her confidence flickered just enough to make him wonder what game she was playing, or if she was playing one at all. Before he could ask, a school bus rumbled down Maple Drive, bright yellow cutting across the dull morning. Lily appeared in one of the windows, waving at him with a grin big enough to break through any bad day. Ethan waved back, pride rising in his chest like it always did. Maggie followed his gaze, her expression softening in a way that didn't match the poised demeanor she'd walked in with. "That's your daughter?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. "Yeah," Ethan said, unable to hide his smile. "She's my whole world." For a moment, something complicated flickered across Maggie's face. A kind of longing, maybe, or regret, or recognition. Whatever it was, it passed quickly, smoothed over by a practiced calm, but Ethan noticed it anyway. He wasn't sure what it meant, but he knew it meant something. When she stood to leave, she hesitated just long enough to ask the question that would echo in his mind for the rest of the day. "If Hartman Motors calls you for another interview," she said softly, "would you go?" Ethan frowned. The question didn't feel hypothetical. It felt like she already knew something he didn't, but he answered honestly. "Yeah," he said, "I'd go." Maggie nodded, relief loosening her shoulders just a little. "Take care, Ethan." Then she turned and walked away with that same steady grace, leaving him holding the most expensive coffee he'd ever drunk and a dozen questions rattling around like loose bolts. As he watched her disappear down the street, one thought pushed its way to the front of everything else. Who exactly was Maggie Haynes, and why did a stranger care so much about the future of a mechanic from Red Willow? He didn't know the answer, but he was about to. 2 days after the strange encounter outside Murphy's Auto Repair, Ethan was lying on his back beneath a Chevy, elbow deep in a brake assembly that refused to cooperate, when the shop phone rang. Usually he barely noticed that sound. It was always someone asking for a quote they wouldn't actually pay, or a customer wondering why their 15-year-old truck still made strange noises even after a $100 fix. But something about the way his boss shouted his name, voice cracking like he couldn't believe what he was saying, made Ethan slide out from under the car faster than he intended. Ethan Murphy barked again, waving the phone like it was burning his hand. "Hartman Motors wants you back. Tomorrow morning, 9 sharp." For a second, Ethan genuinely thought he'd misheard. The words sounded too big, too out of place in this cramped garage that smelled permanently of gasoline and half-finished repairs. He wiped his hands out of habit, even though the rag did nothing, and took the phone with a hesitant grip. "This is Ethan," he said, trying to sound calm. The woman on the other end had a polished voice, smooth, professional, the kind you only heard in big offices or commercials for high-end law firms. "Mr. Miller, this is Janet Morrison from Human Resources at Hartman Motors. We understand you experienced car trouble the morning of your interview. These things happen. We'd like to offer you another opportunity." Ethan blinked hard. Car trouble. He almost laughed. A blown tire wasn't even his, and the story was already getting rewritten by someone who clearly wanted it rewritten. He opened his mouth to correct her, but the weight of the moment settled over him. Whatever happened, someone had pushed this door open for him, and he wasn't in any position to argue about the details. "Absolutely," he said, steadying his voice. "I'll be there." When he hung up, Murphy stared at him like he'd just watched a man get struck by lightning and survive. "What the hell did you do?" the old mechanic asked. "Nobody gets a second shot at Hartman." Ethan didn't know how to answer that. He didn't know which part of yesterday's chaos had triggered this second chance, but he knew exactly who it felt connected to. Maggie, the stranger who didn't act like a stranger. The woman who watched everything he did with a look that suggested she was thinking 10 steps ahead of him. She had to be involved somehow. But why a woman he barely knew would go out of her way to help him was a question with no clear answer, and thinking about it too much made him uneasy. That night, Ethan and Lily turned their tiny trailer into something resembling a prep center. Lily insisted on ironing his only decent shirt, even though the iron sputtered like it wasn't thrilled about being used for anything important. She made him try on 2 different ties, standing back with her hands on her hips like a miniature fashion critic. Her seriousness, her pride in him, it all hit deeper than he expected. "Are you nervous?" Lily asked as she watched him polish his shoes on the kitchen floor. "A little," he admitted. "But sometimes being nervous means you're about to do something important." She grinned because she recognized the phrase, one her mother used to say before big tests, dentist appointments, anything that scared her but needed doing. "You're gonna do great," she said, with a conviction that felt bigger than the room they were standing in. "They'd be lucky to have you." The next morning, the storm clouds were gone, replaced by a crisp sunlight that made Red Willow look deceptively hopeful. As Ethan drove toward the city, his palms grew damp on the steering wheel. He kept thinking about the last time he'd taken this drive, the rain, the panic, the unexpected detour into someone else's life. Now he was being pulled back toward the very place he'd missed. Hartman Motors headquarters looked even more intimidating in full daylight. The glass walls gleamed like they were built to keep people like him out, not in a hostile way, but in the kind of way that made you doubt you belonged before you even stepped inside. Ethan swallowed hard, and walked through the automatic doors. The receptionist greeted him like he was expected. That alone felt surreal. She offered him a smile too warm to be routine, and called someone without even asking his name. Ethan glanced around the lobby, polished floors, towering windows, expensive artwork that made no sense but probably cost more than his truck. Within moments, a woman appeared, tall, efficient, clipboard pressed to her chest. "Mr. Miller, I'm Janet Morrison, thank you for coming." She guided him through a maze of hallways and glass rooms, her heels clicking in a rhythm that matched the thump of his heart. When she pushed open the conference room door, Ethan exhaled, preparing himself for the usual interview nerves. He wasn't prepared for what waited inside. 2 people sat at the table, Tom Stevens, the man he'd researched online, and a woman with her back turned. Tom stood and shook Ethan's hand, introducing himself with a practiced smile. But Ethan barely registered the words, because the woman turned around, and there she was. Maggie, except not the stranded driver, not the rain-soaked stranger, not the woman holding 2 coffees outside the garage. This version of Maggie looked like she belonged exactly where she was, with a quiet authority, a crisp suit, and an expression that revealed nothing but awareness. "Good morning, Mr. Miller," she said, her tone steady and unmistakably in charge. "Thank you for coming in." Ethan felt the ground shift again, that dizzy feeling he got whenever life decided to throw another twist his way. So this was what she'd been hiding. And now, sitting across from her in a room made of glass and expectations, he realized the day was about to get even stranger. When Ethan sat down in the glass-walled conference room at Hartman Motors, he did everything he could to look calm, even though his pulse hammered so loudly he swore the whole building could hear it. He adjusted the tie Lily insisted he wear, tried to smooth the wrinkle in his sleeve, and forced himself to focus on the two interviewers seated across the table. One was Tom Stevens, head of operations, a man who looked like he'd been born in a suit and raised in conference rooms. The other was the woman who had just turned Ethan's brain inside out. Maggie, except she clearly wasn't just Maggie anymore. Tom began with the standard corporate greetings, but Ethan could barely concentrate. His mind kept snapping back to every moment he'd spent with this woman, the way she'd stood helplessly on the shoulder of Route 22, the rain dripping off her coat, the calm voice that cracked just slightly when she admitted she was scared. Even yesterday, showing up at the auto shop with coffee, she looked like someone trying to blend into the background of a small-town life she didn't belong to. But now she sat there wearing authority like a tailored accessory, her back straight, her expression composed, and her confidence unmistakable. She didn't look like a stranded motorist or a grateful stranger. She looked like a woman who led board meetings that determined the fate of hundreds of employees. She looked like someone with power, but she also looked familiar in a new way, like this version of her was the one he should have seen from the beginning. Tom launched into the first question, something about Ethan's work experience, leadership, technical knowledge, but Ethan felt his attention veer off course every few seconds toward Maggie. She didn't interrupt, didn't dominate the room, she simply listened, her gaze steady but unreadable, like she had already formed an opinion but wanted to see if he'd confirm it. That alone was unnerving. When Tom paused to take notes, Ethan cleared his throat. "Before we go further," he said, forcing his voice to stay level, "there's something I don't understand." Maggie looked up first, and for the briefest moment, something flickered in her eyes, not annoyance, not fear but anticipation, as if she'd been waiting for him to reach this point. "What's your question, Mr. Miller?" she asked, her tone calm and professional but warm enough to keep him from shutting down. He hesitated, but the confusion pressing inside him needed an exit. "Why didn't you tell me who you were?" The room fell still. Tom shifted slightly, giving Maggie space to respond, and it was clear this wasn't a surprise to him. He knew exactly who she was. He knew exactly what this moment meant. Maggie set down the pen she hadn't really been using and folded her hands. Her posture didn't change, but the air around her did, softening in a way Ethan recognized from the highway, not vulnerable, but human. "Because I needed to see who you were," she said. The answer didn't solve anything, but it cracked open a different kind of curiosity. Ethan waited, eyebrows lifting slightly, not satisfied but willing to let her continue. Maggie inhaled, not deeply, but deliberately, like she was choosing each word before offering it. "People treat me differently when they know my title, they filter themselves, adjust, perform. Sometimes I meet people who want something from me before they even know my name. And sometimes I need to see someone honest, unfiltered." Ethan stared at her, unsure if he was supposed to feel flattered or manipulated. "So you lied." She met his eyes evenly. "I withheld information." "There's a difference." "Feels the same on my end," he replied. For the first time her composure wavered. Just a fraction, a flicker of guilt. But she didn't retreat from it. "You're right to feel that way, and you have every right to ask more questions." Her voice softened. "But I want you to understand something. I didn't approach you as the CEO of Hartman Motors. I approached you as a woman stranded on the side of the road who was reminded that kindness still exists." Ethan wanted to stay annoyed. Wanted to hold on to the sense of betrayal that had been simmering since he walked into the room and saw her mask drop. But memories of Lily watching him fix that tire, of the fear in the woman's eyes that morning, and the way Maggie had looked when she asked about his daughter, all of it tangled together, blurring the edges of his frustration. Before he could say anything else, Tom cleared his throat and gently redirected the conversation back to the interview. The corporate tone returned, questions about workflow, leadership, technical troubleshooting, hypothetical crises, but Ethan answered with a quiet intensity, even as the tension of Maggie's reveal hung over the room. He refused to let confusion derail him. If this was his chance to step into a better life, he wasn't going to sabotage it with emotion he hadn't sorted out yet. But the moment he knew would come finally arrived. Tom closed his folder. "Before we wrap up," he said, glancing at Maggie, "there's one final question we need to address." He leaned back slightly. "Why did you miss your original interview?" The question slammed into him harder than expected, but Ethan didn't look at Tom, he looked straight at Maggie. "I stopped to help someone who needed it," he said simply. "Someone stranded on the highway in a storm. She was scared and she couldn't fix the problem on her own. I chose to help her instead of rushing here." He didn't say Maggie's name, he didn't need to. The room felt suspended for a beat, then Maggie spoke, quietly, but with a sharpness that landed like a test. "Do you regret that choice?" Ethan didn't blink. "No, I don't regret helping someone who needed me." He hesitated just long enough to make it matter. "But I do have questions about why that someone thought she had to hide who she really was." That hit harder than anything else he'd said so far. Tom shifted uncomfortably. Janet, who had been quietly taking notes at the corner of the room, cleared her throat. "Why don't we take a short break?" she suggested, her voice a little too bright. Tom stood, offering Ethan a polite nod before stepping out. Janet followed, and suddenly it was just the two of them. The conference room felt too quiet, too transparent with its glass walls and city light reflections, but neither of them moved. Maggie stayed seated, her fingers pressed lightly against the table, as if grounding herself. "You're angry," she said softly. "I'm confused," Ethan corrected. "Feels like I stepped into someone else's story without knowing it." A faint smile touched her lips, not amused but understanding. "I didn't expect to see you again that morning. I certainly didn't expect you to change a tire that quickly." She paused. "But when you refused to take money, when you told me to help the next person, it reminded me of someone I used to know. Someone I lost a long time ago." Ethan wasn't sure what to do with that. It felt too personal, too heavy, dropped into the quiet like a stone. "And when I realized you'd missed your interview because of me," she continued, "I couldn't let that be the end of your opportunity. So you pulled strings," he said. "I opened a door," she corrected again, but this time with less distance. "What you do next is entirely up to you." He didn't answer right away. His thoughts swirled with suspicion, gratitude, irritation, curiosity, all pulling in different directions. He'd come here expecting one thing, and now he was face to face with a woman who wasn't at all who he thought she was, yet somehow felt even more real in this version. He finally exhaled, steady and slow. "This isn't how I imagined today going." She nodded. "It isn't how I imagined it either." For the first time since he walked into the room, the tension eased, not gone, but changing, shifting into something more complicated than mistrust. Something layered, something unpredictable. And just as Ethan opened his mouth to ask the question building in his chest, a sharp knock sounded at the door. Janet poked her head in, urgency tightening her face. "Miss Haynes, there's an emergency at Plant 2, Line 3 equipment failure. They need you immediately. Give him a visitor badge and a safety vest, he's with me," Maggie said. Ethan felt the shift, the adrenaline in the air, and something old and familiar woke up inside him. Mechanical instinct. The part of him that solved problems before they turned into disasters. "Let him take a look," Maggie said, "but keep the engineers on standby in case we need to pull him out." Maggie blinked, surprised. "Ethan, you don't work here." "Not yet. But if you want to know who I really am," he said, a certainty settling into his voice, "let me show you." For one suspended moment, they stared at each other, the weight of everything unsaid hovering between them. Then Maggie nodded. And just like that, Ethan Miller stepped into the next chapter of a story he had never expected to be part of. The drive to Plant 2 felt shorter than it should have, even though traffic downtown had slowed to a crawl, and Maggie's BMW moved through lanes with the practiced sharpness of someone used to urgency. Ethan sat in the passenger seat with his jaw tight and his mind already spinning through worst-case mechanical scenarios. He didn't know exactly what he was walking into, but the tone in Janet's voice over the phone had been enough to set off alarm bells. And the way Maggie kept checking real-time diagnostics on her screen, her fingers tapping anxiously, her posture firm, told him this wasn't just corporate inconvenience. Something serious had broken. You don't have to get involved, Maggie said without looking over, though her voice carried the smallest hope that he would ignore the offer. This isn't your responsibility. I know, Ethan replied, eyes fixed on the industrial skyline drawing closer. But you need help. Might as well use the guy who's already in the car. She let out a breath, not exactly a laugh but close enough to crack the tension for half a second. You're full of surprises. Ethan didn't answer. He was already slipping mentally into a mode he knew well, the calm before the chaos space where mechanics lived when faced with a failure that didn't match the manual. His mind flicked through hydraulic systems, conveyor cycles, fail-safes, pressure lines. Whoever designed Plant 2's layout probably never imagined someone like him would be trying to solve problems there, but machines didn't care about resumes or titles. They broke in the same language everywhere. When the BMW pulled into the parking lot, the energy was unmistakable. Employees gathered near the main entrance in clusters that looked too tense for casual conversation. Supervisors stood with radios pressed to their ears, speaking quickly. Even from a distance, Ethan could hear the kind of machinery-like roar that meant everything except the line with the failure was still running. Inside the building, the tension grew thicker. The moment Maggie stepped through the main floor doors, people snapped to attention, not fear-based, but a sudden awareness that leadership had arrived. Several managers swarmed toward her, talking over one another about numbers, deadlines, costs. Line 3 is completely down, one of them said, voice tight. We've tried reboots, resets, pressure checks, nothing, we're hemorrhaging production time. We'll get it resolved, Maggie said firmly, though her eyes flicked toward the problem zone, like she already knew this wasn't a simple fix. When she turned to Ethan, the mask of corporate composure softened. You don't have to do this, she repeated quietly, but with less conviction now. The situation is complicated. Good news, Ethan said, rolling up his sleeves. Complicated is just simple wearing a bad disguise. It wasn't meant to be funny, but Maggie cracked a genuine smile before she led him toward the failing line. As they approached line 3, Ethan immediately understood why everyone looked so defeated. The machine was massive, a network of hydraulic pistons, conveyor belts, sensors, valves, and precision components that all needed to work in perfect rhythm. Right now, that rhythm was dead. Several engineers knelt beside the main control panel, faces stiff with frustration. Tom spotted them and rushed forward. We can't figure it out, he said, shaking his head. We've checked all primary filters, recalibrated pressure, even replaced a sensor bank. The system keeps choking. What kind of choke? Ethan asked. Hydraulic drop, one engineer answered. But only in the secondary loop. We've never seen anything quite like it. Secondary loop, Ethan repeated quietly, like he was confirming something he already suspected. His eyes scanned the machinery, following lines, panels, vents, conduits, mentally tracing possible pathways. Then he dropped to one knee beside the main housing and pulled open a lower access hatch the engineers had ignored. What are you doing? Tom asked, confused. Listening, Ethan said simply. That answer earned him a flurry of baffled looks, but Maggie watched him closely. She recognized the tone in his voice, the steady confidence that came from lived experience rather than manuals. Ethan positioned his ear near the pump casing, ignoring the oil streaks smearing across his collar. He waited, listened, shifted, listened again. Machines spoke in patterns most people couldn't hear, subtle shifts in airflow, vibration, rhythm. This one wasn't whispering, it was complaining. He pushed deeper into the access space, almost lying on the floor, and signaled to an engineer. Give me a flashlight. The engineer hesitated, but Maggie nodded sharply, and the tool was handed over without another word. Ethan shined the beam into the cramped area beneath the secondary assembly. A few seconds passed, then he found it. There it is, he muttered. What? Tom asked. The secondary filter housing, Ethan said, backing out and standing with a slight grunt. It's clogged. Probably hasn't been swapped in months. The engineers stiffened. We changed all filters last month, one protested. Primary filters, sure, Ethan said, wiping his hands. Most people don't know this one exists. They hid it behind a panel for some reason. Bad design choice. But I've seen this kind of setup before. When the secondary clogs, pressure collapses just enough to shut down the line, but not enough to trigger typical alarms. He looked around the room. It's the kind of problem you only notice if you grew up fixing things people swore were already fixed. For a moment, no one moved. Then the realization hit Tom like a physical jolt. "Get that panel removed," he shouted. Engineers scrambled, wrenches clanged against metal, bolts dropped to the floor. Within minutes, the hidden filter was pulled free, coated in thick sludge, so dark and sticky it looked like it had been collecting misery for months. "That'll do it," Ethan said quietly. When the new filter was installed, and the machine rebooted, the entire floor seemed to hold its breath. The lights flickered through initialization cycles. The conveyors trembled. Then with a loud, harmonious hum, Line 3 roared back to life, smooth, steady, perfect. The room erupted. Engineers cheered. Supervisors exhaled like they hadn't breathed in an hour. The tension dissolved into a ripple of relief, and Tom clapped Ethan so hard on the back he nearly knocked him forward. How did you even know?" Tom asked, shaking his head in disbelief. "Machines talk," Ethan answered, shrugging. "If you know how to listen." But Maggie was the one watching him with something deeper than gratitude. As employees glanced her way, expecting her leadership voice, she didn't speak. She just looked at Ethan like she was realizing something important, something that went beyond heroics or technical skill. She was looking at someone who solved problems without needing praise, someone who didn't panic under pressure, someone who helped because that's who he was, not because it benefited him. And Ethan, for the first time all day, felt the full weight of her attention and understood something too. This moment wasn't about proving himself to a company. It was about proving something to himself. Later, outside the noise of the reactivated line, Maggie approached him slowly. "That was impressive," she said softly. "Truly impressive." Ethan wiped oil from his hands, offering a half smile. "Just another Tuesday." "No," she said, shaking her head, her voice steady with sincerity. "Not just Tuesday, this is who you are." The words hung there, unexpected, solid, undeniable. Ethan didn't reply right away, because for the first time in a long time, he didn't feel like a man just surviving. He felt like someone who could actually build something. Someone who belonged somewhere bigger than the four walls of Murphy's shop. Someone who mattered. That evening, after the chaos of Plant 2 finally settled, and the adrenaline faded from everyone except the exhausted supervisors, Ethan returned home with the kind of tiredness that came from using every last drop of instinct and skill he had. He expected the quiet of Maple Grove Trailer Park to be comforting, a sharp contrast to the buzzing factory floor. But when he turned into the lot and saw a familiar figure standing by the steps of his trailer, hands clasped, posture poised but uneasy, his breath paused in his chest. Maggie Haynes. She didn't look like the commanding executive from earlier. She didn't look like the stranded woman from Route 22 either. She looked like someone caught between two versions of herself, unsure which one she was supposed to be right now. Ethan parked and stepped out slowly, trying not to show the swirl of confusion rising again. "Did something happen at the plant?" he asked cautiously. "No," she said, shaking her head. "The line is stable, everything's under control." "Then why are you here?" For a moment, Maggie didn't answer. Her eyes drifted toward the small garden plot beside the trailer, tomato vines. Lily had planted with more hope than skill. She stared at them like they reminded her of something she'd lost. "I needed to see where you live," she said finally, her voice quieter than before. "I needed to understand who you are before I ask you to trust me." Her honesty surprised him, not because it was dramatic, but because it sounded like it cost her something to admit. Before he could respond, the front door swung open and Lily stepped out onto the porch, backpack still slung over one shoulder, even though she had no intention of leaving. When she spotted Maggie, she froze, not scared, just cautious, that same grown-up awareness she'd learned too early in life. "Everything okay, Dad?" she asked. "Yeah," Ethan said gently. "Come here a second." Lily approached, eyes flicking between them. Maggie lowered herself slightly, leaning in with a soft smile that didn't quite hide the sadness behind it. "You must be Lily," she said. "Your dad talks about you with so much pride." Lily blinked. Compliments always hit her harder than they should. She stepped closer, her voice careful but honest. "Are you the lady with the flat tire?" Maggie nodded. "Yes, your dad helped me." Lily studied her, the way kids do when they're trying to decide if an adult is safe or just pretending to be. Then she asked bluntly, "Are you going to give him the job?" Lily paused, studying Maggie carefully before she spoke. Ethan nearly choked. Lily, but Maggie didn't flinch. Instead, she seemed almost grateful that someone had cut through the fog of everything unspoken. "That depends," she answered softly. "It depends on whether your dad wants it." And that was the moment Lily did something Ethan didn't expect. She stepped forward and wrapped her arms around Maggie with a quick instinctual hug, simple, pure, the type that didn't ask permission, because children hadn't learned yet that adults sometimes needed it. "I hope you do," Lily said. "He deserves good things." For just 1 second, Maggie's composure broke. Her eyes shimmered with something raw, something old. There was a grief in it Ethan had never seen before. When the school bus horn blared from the next street over, kids being dropped off from after-school programs, Lily pulled away and waved before darting inside to feed their cat. And suddenly it was just the two of them again, standing under the fading evening light. Ethan crossed his arms gently. "Maggie," he said slowly, "why are you really here?" She turned away, looking out at the row of modest trailers. The air smelled faintly of cut grass and the last bit of summer heat. When she finally spoke again, her voice wasn't commanding or corporate, it was something else entirely. "3 months ago," she began, "my father died." Ethan didn't interrupt. He could feel the gravity of the moment pressing in. "He built Hartman Motors from nothing," she continued. "From a 2-bay garage with 1 lift and a dream. He believed a company only meant something if it treated its people like family. But somewhere along the way, I lost sight of that. I let the board convince me that cost-cutting mattered more than connection, numbers mattered more than names." She hesitated, as if weighing whether to keep going. "On the morning of that flat tire, I was on my way to approve a plan that went against everything my father stood for." The revelation hit Ethan harder than expected. He didn't know her father, but he knew the kind of men who built things with their hands and their hearts. Men like his own father. And then she said, her voice cracking just slightly, "My tire blew. On a deserted stretch of road. I told myself it was terrible timing. Inconvenient, a sign of how my day was going to fall apart." She met his eyes. "I didn't know it was going to save me." He swallowed. The air felt heavier now. "Save you how?" Maggie looked down at her hands, as if she couldn't bear to meet his gaze for what came next. "Because when you stopped, when you chose to help me, even though you were rushing to something important, you reminded me of my father. You reminded me of the kind of goodness I had stopped believing existed." Her voice trembled, forcing her to pause. But Ethan could sense there was something deeper, something she wasn't saying yet. "And there's more, isn't there?" he asked gently. Maggie inhaled slowly, like she was preparing her heart for impact. "I had a son," she said at last. The words fell heavy between them, not loud, but devastating in their simplicity. "He and I," her throat tightened. "We haven't spoken in 20 years. Ethan felt his chest tighten, not judgment, not shock, just empathy. He knew the weight of regret too well. "I chose work, meetings, travel, deadlines." Her eyes glistened. "I kept choosing everything except him. And time doesn't wait for you to fix the things you break." For a long moment, all Ethan could hear was the faint chirp of cicadas rising from nearby fields. "I lost him," she whispered. "And I don't know if I'll ever get the chance to make it right." Ethan didn't speak, not because he didn't have words, but because he could tell she wasn't finished. "That morning on Route 22, she went on, you helped me without expecting anything. You listened when I didn't deserve your kindness. And when you talked about your daughter, about the way you love her, it reminded me of the love I failed to give my own child, when he needed it most." Ethan felt something shift inside him, an understanding he hadn't expected. Maggie hadn't come here out of pity, or gratitude, or obligation from the plant crisis. She came because something in their brief interactions had touched a wound she'd spent years ignoring. "I didn't intervene in your interview because I felt guilty," she said. "I intervened because I saw someone who could remind me what my father tried to teach me." What I lost, what I might still be able to repair, if I'm brave enough. The twist landed not with confrontation, but with a quiet, aching resonance. Maggie wasn't trying to pull Ethan into her world. She was trying to find her way back to the parts of herself she'd abandoned. And Ethan, standing there in his worn boots and faded shirt, suddenly understood why she kept showing up. He didn't try to fix it with platitudes. He didn't say it would be easy. He didn't say her son would forgive her. He just spoke with the grounded compassion that made him who he was. "It's not too late," he said softly. "Not if you want to try." Her eyes filled, but she didn't look away. "I'm scared," she admitted. "So am I," Ethan replied. But scared people do brave things every day. For the first time since he'd met her, Maggie looked like someone who believed she might have a second chance, not at her job, not at her reputation, but at something far more precious: family. The last light of the evening washed over them, warm and fading, as two people who never should have crossed paths found themselves connected in a way neither could have predicted, but both desperately needed. And somewhere inside her chest, a door Maggie had sealed shut decades ago creaked open, letting in a sliver of hope. The sun had dipped low enough that the trailer park was washed in a soft amber glow, the kind of light that made even the cracked pavement look peaceful. Maggie stood there, still trying to steady her breathing after revealing pieces of her past she had spent decades burying. Ethan watched her carefully, trying to understand the weight behind every word she'd spoken, every pause, every tremble. The air between them wasn't heavy anymore, it was honest. That alone changed everything. "Ethan," she finally said, shifting slightly as if bracing herself for whatever came next, "there's something I need to ask you, something important." He raised an eyebrow, but not in skepticism, more like he was preparing himself. Today had been one twist after another, and he knew better than to expect anything simple now. "I'm listening." Maggie exhaled slowly. "I want you to come work for me. For Hartman Motors, not out of gratitude, not because of the tire, not because of today's emergency." She paused, finding the right angle. "I want you because you see problems differently. You move toward solutions instead of away from them. You care about people, not just procedures. That's the kind of leadership my father built this company for. And it's the kind of leadership I need by my side." Her words didn't sound rehearsed. If anything, they came out too raw to be strategic. Ethan didn't answer right away. Instead, he let the moment settle in, because decisions that could change your life weren't meant to be rushed. He glanced toward the window where Lily's silhouette danced behind the curtains, probably feeding their cat or reheating leftover spaghetti for dinner. She was the reason he pushed through every setback, every disappointment, every dead-end job. And now, for the first time in years, a real opportunity was standing in front of him. But Ethan Miller wasn't the kind of man who said yes because something sounded good. He was the kind of man who asked himself if he could live with the consequences. "Maggie," he began, his tone measured, "if I take this job, everything changes. My hours, my responsibilities, my paycheck, my entire life." He shifted his stance. "It won't just affect me, it'll affect Lily." She nodded, understanding the gravity before he even explained further. "I know, that's why I'm offering it to you and not expecting it. I want you to choose this because it's right for your family, not because you feel indebted to me." Her sincerity hovered in the quiet like a fragile truth. Ethan rubbed the back of his neck, a habit he always fell into when facing something big. "Before I say yes," he said slowly, "I have two conditions." That caught her attention. Not in fear, more in curiosity, the kind that made her straighten slightly and narrow her eyes just a little. "Name them," she said. "First," he said, voice steady, "I owe Murphy a proper transition. He gave me a job when nobody else would. He trusted me when my life was falling apart. I'm not walking out on him without finishing what I started. If I take the position, I need 2 weeks to train whoever replaces me. I need to leave that shop the right way." Maggie didn't even blink. "Done. I'll make sure the hiring team coordinates with you." "Second," Ethan continued, tone softer now but somehow heavier, "before I step into your world, I want you to sit down at dinner with me and Lily. Nothing special, just our table, our food." His eyes locked onto hers. "If I'm going to work for you, my daughter deserves to know who you really are, and you deserve to see who we really are too." That was the one condition Maggie didn't expect. For the first time since arriving at the trailer, her confident posture faltered. not dramatically, just enough to reveal a vulnerability underneath, the kind that came from longing for something she hadn't allowed herself to want in years. "You want me to meet your daughter properly?" she asked, not doubting him but trying to understand the weight behind his words. "Yes," Ethan said. "No titles, no pressure, just people." A beat of silence followed, not awkward, just full, like something meaningful had been added to the room. Maggie's eyes softened, really softened, as though she'd been carrying the quiet loneliness of 20 unspoken years on her shoulders, and this simple invitation threatened to crack it open. "I'd like that," she said. Her voice, though calm, held a tiny break in the middle, a sign that this moment was hitting her someplace deeper than she expected. Ethan nodded once, slow and grounded, the way a man nods when he knows the road ahead won't be easy, but at least it will be honest. "Then I'll take the job. After those 2 weeks. And after dinner." Maggie let out a breath, not relief exactly, more like the kind of exhale someone gives when a second chance they didn't believe they deserved has somehow landed in their hands anyway. "Ethan," she said quietly, "thank you." "For what?" "For letting me earn this, for not letting today define my motives, for giving me a place to be more than a CEO trying to fix a broken company." He stared at her for a long moment, realizing she wasn't talking about business anymore. She was talking about family, about regret, about rebuilding pieces of a life she'd lost long before she ever met him. "I'm not giving you anything," Ethan said gently. "You're giving yourself a chance." It wasn't poetic, it wasn't grand, but it struck exactly where it needed to. A soft breeze moved through the trailer park, rustling the tomato leaves and the chalk drawings on the steps. The world around them felt simple in a way corporate towers couldn't mimic. And maybe that simplicity was exactly why Maggie had come, because she needed to step out of boardrooms long enough to remember what real connection felt like. She stepped back toward her car, ready to leave but paused with her hand on the door. "Ethan," she said, turning slightly, "I meant what I said. You're the kind of person my father built this company for. Someone who understands that people matter." He nodded again, slower this time. "And you're the kind of leader he raised." The compliment stunned her for a moment. Then she gave a real smile, the kind you couldn't fake in a business meeting, the kind that made her look years younger because it came from a place she'd kept locked away. "Good night, Ethan." "Good night, Maggie." He watched her car disappear down the lane, taillights glowing softly in the dusk. When he finally stepped inside the trailer, Lily was waiting at the kitchen table with a bowl of strawberries and a grin far too wide to be casual. "So," she demanded, "did she offer you the job?" Ethan sat down, scooping a strawberry from the bowl. "Yeah," he said, "she did. And did you say yes?" He took a slow bite, partly because he wanted to savor the moment, partly because he wanted to see her reaction. "I said yes," he told her, "but only after she comes to dinner." Lily's eyes widened in that sparkly, mischievous way kids get when they sense something exciting and grown-up unfolding. "We're having the big boss over for dinner." "Yep," Ethan said, chuckling, "so we better clean this place up." Lily pumped her fist in the air. "I get to pick the dessert." And just like that, the whole house filled with a warm, almost magical energy, a sense of new beginnings settling into their tiny home. Not because Ethan got the job, but because for the first time in a long time, an opportunity came wrapped in connection, trust and the promise of healing, for all three of them. 6 months later, Ethan stood in the same conference room where everything had nearly fallen apart, and then miraculously fallen together. But this time, the room didn't feel intimidating. It felt familiar, like a space he had slowly grown into, one steady decision at a time. The glass walls still shimmered with the afternoon sun, the polished table still looked like it belonged in a Fortune 500 boardroom, but the energy inside was completely different. Hartman Motors was buzzing with good news. Plant 2 had exceeded production targets for the third straight quarter. Efficiency was up, quality ratings were climbing, employee satisfaction, once hanging by a thread, was now the highest in company history, and the board members who once pressured Maggie to slash jobs were now nodding approvingly as she spoke, impressed to the point of disbelief. But Maggie wasn't the only one they were watching. Several glances drifted toward Ethan, who stood near the end of the table with his arms loosely crossed, not out of defensiveness but out of a quiet confidence he never imagined he'd carry into a corporate building. He wasn't dressed in a suit. He wore clean work boots, dark jeans and a pressed shirt Lily insisted made him look like a TV version of a boss, whatever that meant. Yet he fit the role in a way that went beyond clothes. This was the man who had turned Plant 2 into a place people were proud to work again, starting from the floor, not the office. As the applause rolled across the room after Maggie's closing remarks, Ethan didn't clap. He didn't feel the need to. He just looked around and privately took in the moment, not with pride but with gratitude. 6 months ago he'd been fixing brake pads under a flickering shop light at Murphy's, wondering how he would pay next month's bills. After months assisting the former operations manager and unofficially leading several teams, Ethan was formally promoted. But the real shift wasn't in his title. It was in the way people looked at him, with trust, with respect, with a sense that he wasn't just solving problems but building something. When the meeting dispersed, Maggie walked over to him with an expression that carried both accomplishment and something softer. "How's it feel?" she asked. "Strange," he admitted. "In a good way," she nodded. "My father would have liked you." Ethan gave a small smile. He raised a strong daughter that earned him a quick, quiet laugh, something she rarely let happen inside company walls. As they walked out together through the parking lot, Ethan noticed that Maggie no longer drove her sleek black BMW. Instead, she now used a modest electric sedan she claimed kept her grounded. Whether that was true or she just liked the simpler car, Ethan couldn't say. But she looked more herself driving it than she ever had behind the expensive one. "Any regrets?" she asked suddenly, echoing a question she had asked months earlier after the plant crisis. Ethan paused, thinking carefully. "Just one." Her brow lifted slightly. "Which is?" He looked back at the building, the employees heading home with relaxed shoulders and lighter expressions. "I regret that it took a flat tire for us to find the right direction." Maggie exhaled with a soft smile. "Life has a funny way of forcing us to slow down." "Yet," Ethan said, "or stranding us on the side of the road until someone decent comes along." She didn't argue with that. Later that evening, Maggie drove to the trailer park for dinner, something that had become so normal over the months that neighbors barely blinked anymore. Lily practically flew out the door as soon as she saw her car, waving a sketchbook in one hand. "Maggie, look, I designed a mini conveyor system for my science class. Dad helped me make the ratios work," Lily announced proudly. Maggie beamed. "That's incredible, Lily. May I see?" They sat on the steps together while Ethan finished grilling chicken out back. Lily explained every piece of the drawing with the excited precision of someone discovering who she wanted to become. Maggie listened with the full focus of a woman who used to be too busy for anything but spreadsheets and boardrooms, and now treasured these small moments like they were oxygen. When dinner was ready, the three of them gathered around the tiny kitchen table, the same one where months ago Ethan had confessed to missing his interview. The table was scratched and old, but laughter filled the space around it like it was worth more than anything sold in a showroom. At one point, Lily looked up from her plate and said something that froze both adults in place. "You know," she said thoughtfully, "I think good things happen when you help people, like it spreads." Maggie blinked. "What do you mean, sweetheart?" "Well," Lily said, as if it were obvious, "Dad helped you, then you helped Dad, then Dad helped all those people at the plant, and now everyone's life is better. So, kindness multiplies." Ethan felt something tighten in his chest, not painful but deeply moved. It was the kind of truth only kids could state without overthinking it. Maggie swallowed hard, her eyes glistening. "You're absolutely right," and in that moment, the twist wasn't dramatic or shocking. The twist was simple. A girl who had grown up with far too much hardship had somehow held on to a pure belief that the world could still be good. After dinner, they stepped outside under a sky scattered with early stars. Lily ran to water her tomato plants while Ethan and Maggie stood nearby. "You've created something special here," Maggie said quietly. "With her, with the plant, with everything." Ethan shook his head. "No, Lily did, and the workers did, and you did. I just showed up where I was needed. That's exactly why it works," she replied. A calm silence stretched between them before Maggie spoke again, more hesitantly this time. "I reached out to my son," she said. "Last month." Ethan turned to her surprised. She hadn't mentioned him since the night she'd confessed everything. "How'd it go?" "He hasn't agreed to see me yet," she said. "But," he answered the phone, and he didn't hang up. Her voice softened. It's a start. Ethan nodded, his expression warm. That's more than most people get. I'm trying, she whispered. I know, he whispered back. They stood there together, not as CEO and employee, not as people bound by circumstances, but as two human beings trying to rebuild what life had once broken. 6 months had changed everything, not through miracles, not through luck, but through simple stubborn acts of goodness. And the world around them had changed because of it. Lily's laughter drifted across the yard, the plant's hum carried on in the distance. And Maggie, once a guarded executive, looked like someone who had finally remembered how to breathe. It wasn't glamorous, it wasn't dramatic, it was healing, and for Ethan, for Maggie, for Lily, and for hundreds of workers at Hartman Motors, it was enough. On a brisk October morning, the sky over Indiana glowed the softest shade of gold, the kind of sunrise that felt less like the start of a day and more like the world quietly deciding to be gentle again. Ethan stood outside Plant 2, hands tucked in his jacket pockets, watching the workers file in with easy smiles and coffee cups steaming in the crisp air. 6 months ago, this place had felt tense, tired, worn thin. Today it felt alive. As he turned to head inside, a familiar electric sedan pulled into the lot. Maggie stepped out, dressed simply, not like a CEO preparing for a board meeting, but like someone arriving somewhere she belonged. She spotted Ethan and waved, her smile warm, almost peaceful. You're early, she said, walking toward him. So are you, he replied. I had a good reason. Her voice carried a quiet excitement, something unusual enough to make Ethan pause. I wanted to tell you in person. Tell me what? She took a breath, not a nervous one, but one filled with something fragile and hopeful. My son, he agreed to meet me. Ethan's chest tightened, but in the best way. Maggie, that's incredible. She nodded slowly, eyes shining. We're having breakfast this Saturday. I don't know what will happen. I don't know if we'll fix everything, but, her voice wavered. It's a chance, and that's more than I ever expected to get. Ethan felt that moment settle deeply, quietly, beautifully, because this wasn't just her victory. It was the full-circle echo of a story that had started on a rainy highway with a flat tire, a split-second decision, and a man who refused to drive past someone who needed help. Good things come back around, Ethan said. She didn't answer. She didn't need to. The truth was visible on her face. Before they could walk inside, a school bus rumbled down the street. Lily pressed her face against the window, waving frantically at her dad and at Maggie. Even from a distance, her joy was unmistakable. Look at her, Maggie said softly. She's going to change the world someday. She already changed mine, Ethan replied. They watched the bus disappear, the air warming a little around them. Then Maggie turned, taking in the building behind them, its humming machinery, its workers, its renewed life. You know, she said thoughtfully, my father used to say something I never understood until now. What's that? That leadership isn't about being the smartest person in the room. It's about choosing to do good when it's easier not to. Ethan chuckled. Sounds like something Lily would put on a poster. And you, Maggie added, raising an eyebrow. Whether you realize it or not, they walked inside together, moving in sync, as if the strange path that brought them here had finally settled into something steady. The rest of the day moved fast. Workers stopped Ethan to thank him for schedule changes that made their lives easier. A young technician pulled him aside to show how the new safety upgrades had prevented an accident the night before. Someone had brought donuts, because morale's good again. Even Tom, once rigid and intimidating, patted Ethan on the shoulder like an old friend. And all throughout the day, Maggie watched quietly from the background, not in a corporate way, but in a proud, deeply human way. As if she wasn't just looking at an employee, but at the man who'd unknowingly dragged her back from a life of isolation and regret. Later that afternoon, when the shift whistle ended and the parking lot began to empty, Maggie approached him again. Can I show you something? She asked. Sure. She led him to her office, a space he'd only seen once, back when she was still trying to maintain the polished armor of a CEO who never let her guard down. But now the room looked different. Family photos on the shelves, drawings from Lily pinned to a corkboard, plants she swore she'd keep alive this time. On her desk sat a single envelope. For you, she said. Ethan frowned, opening it. Inside was a printed notice with an official Hartman seal at the top. Employee Recognition Award. He read slowly. Excellence in Leadership. Ethan Miller. He blinked. What is this? Maggie crossed her arms lightly, not defensively, but affectionately. It's the first award we've given out in years, and I wanted the first one to go to someone who reminded this company what leadership actually looks like. Ethan stared at the certificate, not because he needed validation, but because the gesture was so unexpected, so sincere, so earned. I didn't do any of this alone, he said quietly. No, Maggie agreed, but you were the spark. You helped me remember who we're supposed to be. A silence settled, warm, grounding, steady. Then Ethan took a deep breath, the same kind you take when life finally catches up to your heart. Funny, he said, all I did was stop to help someone, and look what happened, she replied. You changed an entire company, you helped me get my family back, and you showed Lily what kindness can do. He couldn't argue with that. As they walked outside one last time, Maggie paused near the door, looking out across the parking lot with a soft smile. Ethan, she said, I want to tell your daughter something when I see her next. What's that? That her dad reminded me the world still has good people in it. Her voice cracked just slightly, but enough to make Ethan feel the full weight of the moment. He didn't reply, he didn't have to. Some stories didn't end with fireworks or loud finales. Some ended like this. With a second chance, with a healed heart, with a father who changed everything by being who he already was, with a woman rediscovering her purpose, with a child learning that kindness echoes farther than she'll ever see. If you want more emotional, heartwarming stories like this, don't forget to subscribe to the YouTube channel, where stories of kindness, healing, and second chances come to life through powerful narration. Follow for more touching stories that stay with you long after the video ends. Turn on notifications so you don't miss the next story that might just change someone's day. Thank you for reading. See you in the next story.
Join us to share meaningful stories by hitting the like and subscribe buttons. Don't forget to turn on the notification bell to start your day with profound lessons and heartfelt empathy.